And after this video, you'll never look at a train rolling into a station the same way again. To understand the problem, you need to picture the contact point, the exact spot where a steel train wheel touches a steel rail. That contact patch, the only point connecting hundreds of tons of rolling metal to the ground, is roughly the size of a small coin. That's it. That tiny circle of metal is the entire grip keeping the whole system honest. Now think about what's riding on top of that coin-sized patch. A fully loaded freight train can weigh anywhere from 6,000 to 18,000 tons. 18,000 tons of coal, grain, or steel pipe, all balanced on a series of contact points you could cover with your thumb. Every single one of those tons is pressing down through that tiny interface between wheel and rail. And here's where the physics gets brutal. Steel on steel is one of the slipperiest surface combinations in the natural world. It has a friction coefficient of around 0.1 to 0.25. Rubber on dry asphalt sits around 0.7 to 0.8. That means a car tire grips the road roughly 4 to 6 times better than a steel train wheel grips a steel rail. Every single time a train brakes, it is working with a fraction of the grip your car takes for granted pulling out of a parking lot. That low friction is actually a feature, not a flaw. It's the reason trains are extraordinarily efficient. Steel wheels on steel rails produce almost no rolling resistance. That's how a single locomotive can pull a train stretching over a mile long across flat terrain without breaking a sweat. It's one of the most energy-efficient forms of land transport ever engineered by human hands. But that efficiency comes with a serious price. And that price shows up the moment the driver needs to stop. A fully loaded freight train traveling at 60 miles per hour needs somewhere between 1 mile and 1.5 miles to come to a complete stop. That is the length of approximately 30 American football fields, laid end to end. 30. Your car, at that same speed on a dry road, stops in roughly 300 feet. The difference is staggering, and it comes almost entirely down to that coin-sized contact patch and the unforgiving physics of steel grinding against steel. And this is exactly where common sense hits a wall. You might assume that engineers solve this problem the same way car engineers did. Bigger brakes, more clamping force, more mechanical power applied directly to the wheel. Just overwhelm the problem with brute force and grind the train to a stop. It seems obvious. It seems logical. But that's not how rail physics works. If you apply too much braking force to a steel wheel sitting on a steel rail, the wheel stops rotating and starts sliding instead. And a sliding steel wheel on a steel rail doesn't stop faster. It stops slower. It destroys the wheel surface. It scores and damages the rail underneath. It eliminates whatever directional control the train still had at that moment. Sliding is not stopping. Sliding is the beginning of a catastrophe, rolling down the track at 60 miles per hour. So the real engineering problem was never about raw stopping power. It was always about grip, maintaining enough friction between wheel and rail to let the brakes actually work. And the solution that railways landed on is one of the oldest and most elegant tricks in the entire history of transport. Sand. Not a high-tech polymer compound engineered in a laboratory. Not a ceramic friction material developed by aerospace scientists. Sand. The same granular material lining the bottom of riverbeds and beaches around the world. Trains have been using sand to improve wheel-to-rail grip since the 1800s. And the principle behind it is almost beautifully simple. When dry sand is introduced between a steel wheel and a steel rail at the moment of braking, it acts as a microscopic mechanical layer between the two surfaces. Thousands of tiny hard particles wedge themselves directly into the contact interface. They don't lubricate the surface. They grip it. They mechanically increase the friction coefficient right at the contact patch, which is the only location in the entire system that actually matters. More grip means that brakes can apply significantly more force before the wheel begins to slide. And that means dramatically shorter stopping distances without losing control. of an 18,000-ton machine. Here's how the system actually operates on a modern locomotive. Every locomotive carries one or more sandboxes. These are sealed containers filled with dry, fine-grained sand, mounted directly on the body of the engine above the wheel assemblies. The sand must be kept completely dry at all times. This is not a minor operational detail. Wet sand clumps together. Clumped sand does not flow freely. And sand that doesn't flow freely is completely useless when you are traveling at 70 miles per hour with thousands of tons of loaded freight cars pushing hard from behind. When the engineer initiates a braking event, either manually through the brake handle or automatically through the train's onboard protection system, compressed air is fed directly into the sandbox. That pressurized airflow pushes the sand down through a narrow delivery pipe that runs along the locomotive frame toward the rail surface below. The pipe deposits the sand precisely in front of the leading wheels, directly into the contact zone, at the exact moment the braking force is being applied to the wheels. The timing is everything. The sand reaches the rail a fraction of a second before the wheel rolls over it. The enormous weight of the locomotive pressing down onto those tiny sand particles forces them to embed into the contact interface between wheel and rail. Friction increases immediately. Grip is restored almost instantly. And the brakes can now do their job properly without triggering a catastrophic, uncontrolled slide. On modern high-speed passenger trains like the Shinkansen in Japan or the Intercity Express in Germany, this entire process happens automatically without any manual input from the driver. Sensors embedded in the braking system monitor wheel rotation in real time. The moment a wheel begins rotating slower than the train's actual ground speed, the system identifies the early warning signs of a developing slide and triggers the sanding mechanism to intervene before the situation can escalate into something dangerous. It is the rail equivalent of an anti-lock braking system in your car, but instead of pulsing the brake pressure to restore grip, the train physically introduces traction particles from the outside directly into the contact zone. This system becomes especially critical in conditions that push steel-on-steel friction to its absolute limits. Wet leaves on the track are one of the most underestimated hazards in all of rail operations. During autumn, falling leaves settle across rails and get crushed by the weight of passing trains. They compress into a thin, almost perfectly frictionless organic film coating the rail surface. Rail operators call it leaf mulch, and it can reduce available grip so severely that entire regional rail networks activate emergency sanding protocols across hundreds of miles of track simultaneously. Moisture, frost, light oil contamination from nearby roads, and even algae growth on infrequently used branch lines all create the same dangerous reduction in available friction. In every one of these cases, sand is the first and most immediate line of defense standing between a controlled stop and a disaster. It seems almost impossible that something this straightforward carries this much responsibility inside a system this complex and this heavy. A contact patch the size of a small coin. 18,000 tons of rolling freight. A friction coefficient barely a fraction of what your car relies on every day. 30 football fields of stopping distance. And the answer to all of it is dry sand, compressed air, and a pipe pointed at the rail. That is not primitive engineering. That is physics understood so completely and so honestly that the simplest possible solution turned out to be the correct one. Engineers have had over a century and a half to replace sand with something more sophisticated. And they keep coming back to sand because it works in freezing temperatures. It works in heavy rain. It works at high speed. It requires no electronics, no chemical reaction, and no complex mechanism that can fail at exactly the wrong moment. The oldest solution is still the best solution. And that, more than almost anything else in engineering, is worth stopping to appreciate. Now I'm curious. Sand handles grip at the contact patch. But what actually generates the stopping force inside the wheel assembly itself? Because modern train brake systems are every bit as layered, as precise, and as surprising as everything we just walked through. The carbon composite brake disc